Hello and welcome back to a surprise and unplanned after party. Feels funny calling it an after party, but that's a standard term in this online kind of creative content world. And so we had such a really great response there, Frank. A lot of people were commenting and wanting to add some thoughts and ideas, and a few said, "Hey, let's have an after party discussion of that gospel message." Some people weren't sure what we were doing. Some were very sure. People were lapping it up. And essentially, what we just watched, and people encourage you, go back and watch season 9, episode 14, and listen to this wonderful gospel message that Frank Merendino shared for us here in SDAQ&A. Some people have asked me, is this like Voice Life Fellowship? Well, it was kind of sponsored by Voice Life Fellowship. And that is a group that I started, I think, in 2020. Called Voice Life Fellowship, where we focus mainly on the four gospels. It's a way to kind of clear people's kind of filters and get back to some real basics. And the thing I love about the four gospels is that atheists and Christians, anyone that just likes to have a life that has a bit of guidance and abundance, all of that can be found there in the four gospels. So it's a great way to find common ground and to build from that. From that idea, recently, from one of my interviews with you, actually, I thought, this guy, not only are we sort of scrutinizing and asking big questions of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, Frank is actually sharing kind of a gospel message here. And I thought, wouldn't it be great to share that within the SDA Q&A community, where a lot of members are either fringe or they've left the church, they're a bit confused about what the gospel is. And so I thought, let's bring Frank back to share a gospel message into that broader community without any restraints about it having to be only in the four gospels. So, yeah, and it went really well. People really enjoyed it. A lot of people were writing amen, amen. And so I might even bring up a few comments and questions that came up just before. But for those who may have just joined us now, don't know what I'm talking about, didn't get to see it, share with us just a summary of what your message was today. Thank you, Frank.
Well, I mean, the title was Beyond the Turning Point, and that is, when you get to chapter 3 in Colossians, Paul talks about the turning point that believers there and believers in general experience, and that is, and he pinpoints it at baptism, that you've been buried with Christ, you've died with him, you've been raised by the power of God to life from the dead, a new life in him. And not only that, so not only does that cover your life now, and it's changed your life and changed your status with God, but it also ensures your future with God. When Christ, who is our life, appears, we will also appear with him in glory. So this is what God has done and is planning to do. And you're part of this. And the rest of what Paul was talking about springs from that turning point. Your life used to be like this before that. Don't go back to that. That's setting your mind on earthly things, as he puts it. Set your mind on things above is what he then delineates in the rest of the section of the chapter. And it's really very highly relational instruction, because to set your mind on earthly things is divisive and destructive and distorts the image of God in us, distorts us as human beings, distorts our relationships. And but to set our minds on things above is just the opposite. It's focused on kindness and compassion and forgiveness and so on and so forth. And I would say, if you wanted to sum it up, it's like Paul calling them to be what they are, to be what they already are, to live out the calling with which they already have been called. In Ephesians, he says, live a life worthy of the calling with which you've been called. And that calling, that calling and that setting apart for this life happened at their baptism.
Yeah.
And that's really, we tend to look at baptism like oh, it's just a ritual, it's just a public display. Paul is investing it with something much more powerful. What he's saying, it's invested with something much more powerful. So,
Yeah, that's great.
so beyond the turning point.
Yeah. It's almost like where you pointed out in Colossians that was ground zero. It's happened.
Right.
What's beyond that? And
Right.
then I got a lot of out of it from, like, how does that apply to living your actual life in community? And
Well, and I also find that the traditional ways in which we look at the gospel focuses so much on justification and about how, and almost like we're allergic to works. There's nothing we can do. We can't contribute anything. We got to be careful that we're not doing it all from the wrong motives. We got to make sure that we're not thinking we're earning anything. That's not what Paul talks about at all. I mean, he's just saying, look, salvation is about this now shared life. It's not a solo act anymore. It's this shared life with others. Look at all the times he says each other, one another. And that phrase, each other or one another, is the most repeated phrase in all of the New Testament.
yeah,
That should tell us something about what salvation looks like.
yeah. So we're getting a few people rejoining us that did watch the program, and I've just mentioned there, hey, fire a question out to Frank, talk about the program, ask some other questions. I'll just quickly bring up some of the comments from the Facebook group. Remember, if you're watching within the Facebook group, I can see your comments, but I can't bring them onto the screen. So if you want to have me bring them onto the screen, you need to go to YouTube or to the Facebook page. And there, when you write a comment, I see it and can bring it onto the screen. So while people from there may be doing that, we've had a lot of people writing. So Jennifer Quick wrote, Amen. Lino wrote, isn't that beautiful? Being thankful is realizing the Spirit is working. Others wrote, thank you. Excellent, Frank. Jennifer wrote, please, weekly. Teresa Adams wrote, this is the bread and water of life. This is Christianity, wrote Carl. God defines himself as love. Jeffrey Pankhurst writes, thank you, Frank. God bless you. And there were many more there that came through. So I think what we were hoping to do has happened, where I wanted to present into the broader SDA community an opportunity just to sit back and listen to a gospel message. Sure, a lot of the time at SDAQ&A we scrutinize and test the big belief claims that the Seventh-day Adventist Church makes. But I was quite shocked to read some of the comments. People were saying, hey, while I was an Adventist, it's only now that I realized I didn't really understand the gospel, and was I even a Christian? Now, of course, that's going to get a lot of pushback from current Adventists who, I'm not saying they haven't grasped the gospel, but some people have felt that. Why do you think that for some Adventists, not all, but for some, it is confusing to understand the gospel in their Adventist message?
Before I answer that, I like what Rick is
Yes, I'm
posting
about
here.
to bring that up on the screen.
Yeah, for the
So we'll
love of
come.
Christ, right from 2 Corinthians, is
Yeah,
corroborating what it was pointing out from
yeah,
Colossians. Paul was consistent with this. For the
yeah,
love of Christ controls us, having concluded this, that one died for all, therefore all died.
yeah,
And he died for all, so that they who live might no longer live for themselves, but for him who died and rose again on their behalf.
yeah. Let's
Yeah,
bring that up now, and we can come to that other bit later.
yeah,
That's what you just read there. And
yeah.
he died for all. See, when I take that, I'm trying to, as you've gathered, be inclusive of humans out there who want to seek some kind of positive framework. And I've often said it, you can be agnostic or gnostic, anywhere in between, and find gems for living and building community and finding some kind of cohesive framework from the Gospels, from the teachings of Jesus. So some people approach it and go, I can't grasp the supernatural stuff yet, but I can really grasp these teachings. And other people take it further, as you've demonstrated today. But I think it's for all to live a life more abundant.
Yeah.
And I get a bit of pushback from that, but who am I to judge where people are at and what part of the journey they're at? I want people in this group anyway to feel welcome and not pushed into corners. And your presentation earlier, and I really hope people get to go back and watch it, was all about that good news. And the good news and all that light just pushes everything aside. Let's bring some more on before they start disappearing. Rick adds, beautiful message that was simple to understand. It has to be simple. Most of the world aren't scholars. And I guess that kind of answers the question I asked, is maybe Adventism, it's hard for people to find the gospel in there because it seems to be a rabbit hole of so many different mazes and paths you've got to walk to, whereas what Rick says there is incredible. It's simple. Ray adds, and I'll just bring stuff up. You just comment as it comes through, because we're getting. I thought for a moment we only had like a few people and no one was asking questions, but it's great. So this is the after party. Those that have joined, and go back and watch the full episode of the message that we're talking about. Ray says Adventists don't comprehend new creation. Christians are new creations. Any thought on that?
I wouldn't totally agree with that, because I was in the Adventist church for over 30 years, and I know enough people who understood that and even experienced that.
I think what we're trying to say,
The
perhaps what
idea
Ray
that
was
have
saying,
to
is
be, the
it's
idea of
hard.
being born.
You can achieve it, but it's harder to maybe find your way.
Well, that Adventists know that you have to be born from above. There are plenty of Adventists I know who know that and who have experienced that. The problem with Adventism is that it adds all kinds of conditions to that kind of starts to negate that. Namely dietary, worship day, Sabbath, that sets the whole denomination apart from everybody else. And those are things that Paul talks about, like just right in Colossians, saying, like, don't let anybody impose these things, judge you on these things, and that's where Adventism, that to me, gets all balled up. But it's not like there aren't individuals in Adventism who don't know the experience of Christ. I mean, I had an experience with Christ even being an Adventist, But yeah, maybe I would agree with the system of belief muddies it all up.
Yeah, I think there's that idea of it being a new creation and the word things being muddied up. I think there's a lot to explore there. Angela writes, and thank you, Angela, also for putting me in touch with Dr. Clinton Baldwin, who we're going to try and get on the show too. And another quick plug, tomorrow, Matthew Cortman will be coming on and chatting about Ellen White. And did she believe that the Apocrypha was inspired? So that's tomorrow at 6:30 p.m. Wednesday Pacific time and 11:30 a.m. Thursday Australian time. So Angela says SDA has a false gospel. That's why it's so hard to understand. It's wrapped in the requirements of the law, so hidden. And Rick adds, the love of Christ compels us to live, to love others around us, friend and foe. Mimi West writes, what what others had said in the actual presentation you made, episode 14, season 9. I don't think that I ever heard the gospel while I was SDA. Now, this lady has only recently started watching SDAQ&A, and today is the first time she's watched live. Hey, Rachel, welcome to SDAQ&A. And she has asked, may I ask where you've ended up denomination-wise post-Adventism? Apologies if you've shared this already and I missed it. I'm fascinated by the different theological directions people end up going.
Yeah, I'm still in transit.
And in many ways, SDAQ&A is like a transit station. People are here. Which train are they going to catch?
Yeah.
And so while you're all here in transit, I hope that you find a bit of a home. And today's message from Frank was offering that, here's what we're talking about that can be seen as beneficial. Ray writes, Adventist thinks Christianity is behavior modification. Christianity is about dying and being born again with a new nature, a new creation. I think he's just elaborating on what. Yeah, thanks, Ray. 2320 here. I'll stay up for a gospel discussion any day. We've got to get this. Awesome. Now, remember, Rick, last time we had our after party, we actually invited people to come onto the program and be in the screen. I don't know if you're open to that at all, Frank, but that's what we did last time.
Yeah. Could I have a crying baby in the next room right now?
Well, I might bring some people on to chat about your conversation, but just come back when you can. Would that be all right?
Let me step out and I'll see if I can come back. I'll be right back.
Frank Rick has asked Frank, can you comment quickly on the importance of understanding the law-gospel relationship to one another? The gospel has to include Romans 1:3 and understanding our true condition without Christ. So, Frank, Rick, why don't you come and ask Frank? Why don't you come on the program? Ray, you're welcome. Mimi also, Angela, Rachel even, who's just joined. Is it Rochelle? Is it Rochelle or Rachel? Rachel, perhaps. And anyone watching, why don't you come on and join us? I will put in the link the button to click while Frank just goes there and attends to his gorgeous little bubba. Okay, so here's the link. So I've just put it in the comments there. And those watching also on Facebook, let me try and put the link for you also. So those watching in the Facebook group, I've just clicked and put the link in the comments. Why not click that link and literally come on the actual program? And you can chat with us there. Those on YouTube, I've sent the link. Those on Facebook, I've sent the link. And while Frank is just finishing up there with his baby, some of you might like to come and join us. And let's see, Jim Baker. I found that sanctification turned into legalism and overshadowed the good news of justification from the cross. Yeah. So, Jim, click the link. Come and join us. Let's do what we did last time. After party. Come on the actual program. So those who have just joined us and wonder what on earth we're doing, this is an after party chatting about the gospel message that Frank Merendino just shared in season 9, episode 14, the one just below. So I'm hoping some of you, come on, Rick, click that link. And Rochelle has just written, love the way you put that. I'm in transit too. Don't know where I'm headed yet, but I hope I end up somewhere safe. And Rachel, I hope that you feel safe here to share your thoughts, your journey. And while you're in the SDA Q&A transit train station waiting to board the train to your destination. I hope we can provide some stimulating conversation as well as some gospel messages that just, really resonate and click with you. So, yeah, it looks like I'm not having much luck twisting anyone's arm to come onto the program. And we'll give it a minute to see if some of you want to literally come on. Click the link that I've put in the comments. There's a link there on Facebook, and there's also a link in the YouTube section there in the comments. And Cal Brinsmead, you're watching. Why don't you click the link above and come on and share some of your thoughts? Have a discussion there. Rick, click the link. Jim, Mimi, Ray. I invite people. This is very spontaneous. Someone's coming on. Who is it? Who have we got here? Rick. Great. Let's bring you on, Rick. How are you, my friend? Good to see you.
Good. How are you, Peter?
I am terrific. Great to see you again.
Yes.
And let me just check here. Someone else is trying to come on as well. Give me a second to organize that. How are you doing? What did you think of the gospel message and this kind of new idea of bringing a message in regularly into those who are kind of in transition?
Yeah, I thought it was really good, Peter. It balances out, what you normally present.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, like personally, lately, I felt like the show was, shaking up a lot of conflict.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, I mean, to have
Yeah.
a message like this that that gets put out there, the gospel getting put out there is never a wrong thing.
Yeah. Well, what I've noticed in all of this kind of shaking up a lot of kind of, like you say, conflict, I notice a lot of people, and to be fair, SDAQ&A has been doing that for 8 years.
Mm-hmm.
And what I had initially was doing in 2020, so 4 years ago, was sending people across to Voice Life Fellowship to say, hey, look, if you want to be out of this kind of robust SDAQ&A commentary land, go over there, safe waters, nice and easy. And it has been working, but what I realized is that people are here building community in SDAQ&A, and people are writing in the comments, yeah, I've been shaken by all of this. Where do I go? What do I do? I want to be fed now.
Mm.
And I thought, it's people come to places where they're used to coming. So there's about 8,000 people, broadly speaking, in the SDAQ&A land of membership. And I thought, well, they're not really jumping over to Voice Life Fellowship, so why not just bring that good news here into this platform, into this audience?
Yeah.
And I think that's going to be, I mean, judging by today, I think that's going to be a really positive move forward. So, yeah, we'll see how we
Yep.
go. The whole SDAQ&A is one big organic unfolding. Where does it go? It's got its own kind
Yeah.
of life.
Yeah. I think what happens sometimes is that when you like as this, well, I'll just say this, Peter. I don't want to talk about this right now, but I did send in my letter this past Saturday.
Whoa, that is
Yeah.
big.
Yeah. So I won't talk about it now.
No, boy,
Um,
I'd love to talk about it at some point. Be
mhm.
amazing. That's a big step, mate. Big
Yeah,
step.
and not for the reasons I maybe thought I would have done it for.
Wow.
I'm really at peace with it. Um, but yeah, I think what happens sometimes is when we stay in our own community too much, we never hit resistance, and we don't hit resistance from other people and other beliefs and stuff like that. It doesn't help us to be able to like accept their point of views like SDAQ&A, I cut my teeth literally coming on this platform and meeting people like Rodney.
Yeah.
You know, and I remember when I first saw his comments in the chat, and I was like, this guy annoys me. And honestly, that's how I felt. And then I realized, hey, wait a minute, it's like people have different views,
Mm.
and we're all on our own journey, and we're all on our own walk, and it's okay for people not to be in the same place. um you know, I think what's way more important is like what Frank was speaking about this evening. If the gospel doesn't push you into a way of life that makes you more tolerant and more open-minded to other people without just hating people because they don't
Mm.
think like you,
Mm.
um, because I don't see in the Bible that Jesus chose sides.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
You
And,
know,
isn't it interesting? Like,
hey Frank.
Hey, how you
yes,
doing,
Frank's
Rick?
back. Frank's back. Welcome back, Frank.
Thanks.
Isn't it interesting, Rick, that like it was only when I was interviewing Frank the first time a few months ago that I thought, why haven't I thought of this before? To bring someone like Frank, and I want someone like you as well down the track when you're ready
Yeah.
to do a similar thing. Why didn't I think about that before? Why has it taken 8 years to go? Well, instead of trying to say, "Hey, go over there," or "Come over," we've got a community here. There's people in this group that whenever we come live, I can see everyone going, "Hey, Rick. Hi, Andy." Even hi, Rodney. People are building friendships within this community, and I thought, why has it taken that long to go? Hey, why don't we bring some of that good news into this community while they're at this crazy transition train station, New York Central Station, deciding what to do and where to go. Let's, set up a little busker playing some music. Let's have someone like yourself and Frank sharing a gospel message. I wonder why that took so long for the penny to drop. For me, I'm glad it has, because I think we've now got a community there, judging by today's reaction, that are hungry for it. Yeah. So why don't you ask your question there? I'll bring it up on the screen that you asked to Frank earlier, and let's hear what Frank's reply is. You can read it out if you can see it there.
Yeah. Can you comment quickly on the importance of understanding the law gospel relationship to one another? No. It's not a quick answer subject. To do that justice is, I'm not saying this in an insulting way either, but we live in such a soundbite culture that we want, four spiritual laws, we want proof text, we want something simple to explain, sometimes some things that are very complex. And I believe that what Paul says about the relationship between law and gospel is something that's nuanced and more complex than we usually allow for. Even just his attitudes about the law. I mean, I saw somebody the other day say, well, Paul's attitude towards the law was that the law's purpose was to magnify sin. Period. Paul's attitude towards the law and what he said about the law was so much more deep and complex and nuanced as someone who had risen to a new life in Christ. His whole views of the law were changed, but he says various things about the law in various places, and you have to really go through his letters and put that all together before you just give an answer like that. And I think it's the same with law and gospel as well. Part of it is because I think part of the problem is, I think, when we think of the relationship between the law and the gospel, we think in terms of, well, life under the law is you're trying to earn your way to heaven, and life under the gospel is you've grasped the free grace of God. And I believe that that's a caricature of what Paul is saying and not really what he's saying. That when Paul was commenting on the difference between the law and the gospel and the responses to both, he always had the issue of Jews and Gentiles in the background shaping what he was saying. Because Paul was the apostle to the Gentiles, and Paul was going out into the Gentile world preaching the good news of King Jesus, the crucified and risen Messiah. And what he saw was Gentiles coming to faith in Christ and having their lives transformed, and these communities of believers forming, totally independent of the law. And the law was not just like a set of universal legal requirements to get into God's good graces. The law was the Jewish covenant. It was the covenant that marked out who Jews were in the world. And the issue was very often that he faced was Gentiles do not have to become Jewish in order to fully belong to God. So that changes the relationship between the law and the gospel from the ways that we usually think about that relationship as modern people. It's not necessarily the way Paul thought about it. To unpack those differences would take a while. I think a little more time than
Fair enough.
than what we have here now.
Mm.
But maybe it's something we could tackle in another.
Yeah. What are your
another
thoughts on that, Rick? On the question you
At least
raised?
that's my thinking about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I guess my question was aimed, at the, the gospel is often shared as good news, and what gets shared is just the good part of the gospel. But when you're going through Romans chapter 1-3, whether it's Romans chapter 1-3, whether it's John the Baptist showing up, Jesus showing up, the 7 churches in Revelation, there's a call to repentance. There's an unveiling of what humans' natural condition in Romans 1-3. And that oftentimes that's something that gets dropped in modern preaching. But I don't hear that much anymore. And how that's what I was talking about when I was saying that the law's relationship to gospel, that the law's function is to place everyone under condemnation so that God can offer his free grace to everyone and level the playing field. That's the way I understand it. When you get to Romans 11 and it talks about the mystery of Israel's salvation, and that essentially, Paul at the end there says, like, how can we understand God's plan, right? Because he places the Jews on the earth as a special people, only for them to reject what he's actually offering, give it to the Gentiles to cause some jealousy there with the Jews, so that ultimately everyone in the end is saved, and everybody's scratching their head going like, that's not the kind of plan I would have drew up.
Yeah, where he says God has consigned all to disobedience that he might have mercy on all.
Yeah.
I would say one thing, and this might, I don't know if you've considered this or if this, you're articulating Romans 1-3 in the way that I've traditionally heard it, which is like Calvinist total depravity of human beings.
Mm-hmm.
However, even in those chapters, Paul is still addressing, when he uses the word all, he's not talking about all individuals. He's talking about all, meaning Jews and Gentiles. Neither group is exempt. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Does that mean Paul didn't recognize good individuals? He's not talking about individuals as much as trying to knock down Jewish privilege. As a matter of fact, in Romans 1, verses 18-30, when he catalogs all the sins of human beings, they worship the creature rather than the creator, so on and so forth. Scholars have looked at that. That was a typical synagogue sermon of the time. So if Romans was read in a synagogue, all the Jewish members of the synagogue, or even Jewish members of the church in Rome, would have been saying, yeah, Paul, preach it about those Gentiles, because they would have heard that as a catalog of Gentile sin. And then he turns around and says, and who are you to judge? No. Now, turning the tables on Jews. The other thing that I've read, and take it for what it's worth, is that Paul was using rhetorical language there and using hyperbola. so that he was overstating the case of just how rotten human beings are, to make the point that really to drive home the point that Jews don't have anything over Gentiles to boast about. But it was
Yeah.
not to make the point that every individual in the world is a murderer, a pervert, So again, I think some of that backdrop can shed a little bit of a different light on it. Even Jesus saying to Nicodemus, "You must all be born again."
Mm-hmm.
Who is he talking to? He's talking to the chief teacher of all the Jews. And what he's trying to say is your bloodline, your religious pedigree, all of that does not qualify you. In other words, you're no different than anybody else who's not a Jew. The next story in John's gospel is the Samaritan woman. We go from the best of the best, Nicodemus, to the worst of the worst. And she's the one that gets it, and Nicodemus is the one who walks away puzzled. The point being is that the playing field is level. All are in need. Now how bad everybody is, I mean, individually, that's another story. But I don't think that those are the main points necessarily being made. You might disagree, you might agree.
No.
I'm not sure where I totally stand on that either. I'm just throwing out some ideas.
And out of interest, Rick, like what when and this is to help me as I ask people to present gospel messages in the future, because obviously, as we've discovered, there's been a really positive response to today's message. It is that kind of, if you were to give a gospel message and include those thoughts that you've got there, at what point when someone is sharing a gospel message do they leave some of the things that can lead to conversation out of the gospel message? I don't know. I've never done a gospel message. I don't even know how to do one unless it's a one-on-one conversation, having a cup of coffee somewhere. Because it is the point of giving a gospel message focusing on the unifying common ground beliefs, or is there a space to unpack, hey, and some people see it this way and others see it that way, and include that conversation in the presentation? Do you know what I mean? Am I making any sense?
I mean, if I had to pick just off the top of my head, if I wanted to speak the gospel message without actually using my own words and just use the scripture, I'd probably go to Romans 5. And I'd say, for while we were still helpless, at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. Like, I'd just say that, like, I totally agree what Frank is saying about Romans chapter 1-3. And I'd like to just share something here that I think, adds to what he was saying. In Acts chapter 8, verse 1, it says that Saul was in hearty agreement with the putting of Stephen to death. All right, it says he was in hearty agreement. Well, if you go to Romans chapter 1, the last verse, where Frank was talking about the list of sins that is laid out there. And it says, "And all they know the ordinance of God, that those who practice such things are worthy of death. They not only do the same, but also give hearty approval to those who practice them." You see you see how those two verses actually resemble each other? I think Paul is actually condemning himself at the end of chapter 1 here, because he's saying that sinners approve of these things, and Paul did the same thing himself. So I think Paul understood the gospel, not just because he understood what Jesus did, but he actually understood who he was in relation to Christ.
What he did, yeah.
I
think what the point I was trying to make about Romans 1-3 is that when you see Paul engaging in such stark language, or even John, because John's theology in a lot of ways is close to Paul, contrasting Nicodemus and the Samaritan woman, and Jesus saying to Nicodemus, "You got to be born again." Jesus doesn't say that to everybody. He said that to Nicodemus, and as the representative of the Jews, that both Paul and John are fighting this idea of boasting, this idea of boasting about racial and religious pedigree that somehow sets you apart from everybody else. And so it's like using extreme measures to just tear that all away and knock it all down. And I think possibly the problem with more contemporary preaching of Romans 1 through 3 is that it makes it sound like every single individual that ever lived is just a totally rotten, filthy sinner, you know. And I don't think that's what Paul was after in that. And that's where I was saying, like, it's known that he was using, you know, rhetorical hyperbole in those chapters to make his point, you know. So it's just something to think about, you know, maybe a different way of reading what he was saying.
I think that's a good point. I think that's something, I'd like to go back and read, because you have the passage also that says that those who do not have the law, you know, by instinct, do those things that were written in the law. It's a law unto themselves.
Yeah.
So yeah.
He's
I can see how that would fit there.
There are Gentiles out there who basically saying are good people. You know, look, just think of practical life. We walk around. Is every person that you meet a filthy, rotten person? I know some unbelievably beautiful, wonderful people that I work with. Some who aren't Christians, some who are. You know, I'm going to approach them with the gospel by saying, okay, first we have to establish that you're a dirty, rotten, filthy sinner. You know, okay, that's Dale Carnegie, how to win and influence people, you know, make friends, however Dale Carnegie put it. You know, but you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And I don't think that, you know, I think that having to understand the context of what Paul was battling could temper our view of what he was saying about the human condition in those chapters. There's a reason why he was using such stark, you know, vivid language about how rotten human beings are. It's because he was attacking Jewish privilege.
Some good context there.
Yeah, because that has to fit with the fact that it's the goodness of God that leads people to repentance.
Right.
So you're right. You can't just be beating people over the head with their
Right.
Point taken. Yeah.
Interesting that I think all three of us are musicians. It's interesting, as I performed worship music into the general Christian body from about 1983 onwards. So a lot of Adventist stuff, but a lot of singing each week in different denominations. I noticed, now that I'm doing SDAQ&A, I kind of think I notice how people interact with the gospel. And when you would hear a Baptist gospel message, or Episcopalian, Anglican, or all the different churches, you know, the small Vine group, you know, family group, or whatever they called themselves, I'd notice they'd present the gospel and kind of flourish in the good news conversations afterwards about it. But I notice with Adventists, as we approach the gospel, the simple gospel message, which you mentioned, Rick, in one of your comments, there seems to be, like, for example, with what I call the gospel Adventists, there seems to be a lot of, but what you said there doesn't totally match with Daniel this or that there. Adventists seem to approach the gospel with an eye to disagree, and almost a checklist that you've got to make sure you tick all these boxes before it's the real gospel. I don't know, again, if I'm making sense, but I find that when Adventists approach the gospel, it's with an eye to kind of dissect it and find out who's got a more accurate version of it. Whereas the other Christian body, as I've met with them and for decades, kind of fellowship with them, they have an eye to the common ground that they discover in it. And when they dissect it, it seems to be less, mine's a little bit more right than your version kind of thing. Have you both seen that within the even this setting of the SDA Q&A? And just quickly, Cal Brinsmead, I want to bring you on. You did come into the group there. Come back. We're just going to wrap this tiny bit up, and then I'm going to bring you in as well. So come back in, Cal. Any thoughts on that? Because I think as we enter into this idea of presenting, I had a couple of people before today write to me and say, but is Frank going to share the accurate gospel message? It seems a bit different to my view of the gospel message, and I'm like, I want to somehow create a culture where we don't head down that path so much. Does that make sense? What are your thoughts?
I can say for myself that I'm growing in the grace and the knowledge
Yeah, yeah,
of what that is, and I think I extend myself that grace.
yeah,
I know for a fact that I'm convinced that I don't understand the fullness and how beautiful the gospel is, and I just try to offer that to other people. It's, you are where you are,
yeah.
and that's okay.
Exactly. Yeah. And that is part of this culture we're building too, that no judgment. Where you're at is where you're at. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to just bring up some comments, and then hopefully Cal will be back in by then. And you can comment on this or just nod your head. I'm just going to bring a few up so we've got a bit of engagement. Jim writes, I found that sanctification turned into legalism and overshadowed the good news of justification from the cross. And I'll just read these unless you guys jump in. Rachel has said, the gospel SDA taught me was Jesus' death only covered sins till baptism. All sins after that were my responsibility to overcome, atone for, etc., in order to stand before God without a mediator.
Now, compare that statement, and I'm not invalidating what her experience was, but think about that statement and that perspective of what life in the gospel is like to what was just sketched out from Colossians. And notice what the difference is. It's stark difference. That's all about the individual overcoming of sin. What Rachel just offered.
Yeah, and she's not saying that that's her view. She's saying that's what she felt Adventism taught her.
That's right. And that's a sad commentary because, and it's not just Adventism, it's modern Christianity presents a very individualistic view of sin and salvation. It's all about overcoming my sins, or it's all about my personal salvation. But look at what we just read from Colossians. It's all about life together. Paul wasn't talking about the overcoming of personal sin as much as how they were. Look at the phrase he kept using: each other, one another.
Yep.
What Rachel is pointing out is ends up being totally self-focused. It gets you focusing on yourself.
Yeah.
That's what I found in reading Ellen White's books.
Yeah.
It was like a mirror was put up, and all you're doing is looking at yourself.
Yeah. She says in that comment, all sins after that were my responsibility to overcome. Yeah. It's all about the self.
Whereas Paul is saying in that chapter that we read in Colossians, which I find so beautiful, he's saying, you know, since you've been raised with Christ, set your mind on things above, you know. You died and your life is hidden, is buried with Christ, in Christ with God. You know, and then he goes on, he says, you know, you've been raised because you've already been buried and died. He said, and when Christ, who is your life, appears, you will also appear with him in glory. He sets the table with that first. This is who you are. This is what's happened to you. This is your destiny.
And we're
That's
all in this
a
together.
done deal as far as Paul is concerned.
Mm, mm,
Now, what does it mean to authenticate that in your daily life?
mm,
He doesn't just talk about overcoming personal sin. He talks about how they're to relate to each other as the body of Christ in
mm,
community. That gets you outside of yourself
mm.
immediately. I love the 12 steps, you know, the 12 steps, Alcoholics Anonymous. The first word of the 12 steps is we, not I, because addiction is a disease of isolation.
Wow. Yeah.
Recovery happens in community. That's what the 12-step communities know. That's
Yeah.
why there's such success stories that come out of them, because
Yeah.
they grasp the power of community.
Yeah.
And this is what God is not just saving a bunch of disconnected individuals who he's saying, okay, overcome, here's a jump start from the Holy Spirit, overcome your personal sins. He's putting the body of Christ puts us together.
Mm,
It connects us to the point where Jesus says, whatever you do to the least of these, you do to me.
yeah. I've loved getting to know both of you guys over the last 12 months. And I feel like we are on this journey together.
Yeah.
And the part of it that feels like safe is that it's we together. We're supporting each other as we go along this journey. And as I see a lot of the names in the comments, I feel the same way about them as well.
Can I
Um,
share? Can I share something, Peter?
sure.
Just a personal experience in Matthew 18:21. This is how I've heard it when I was in the SDA church. Right? It's the parable of the unforgiving servant. Okay. Then Peter came to him, said, "Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him? Up to 7 times?" Jesus said to him, "I do not say to you up to 7 times, but to 70 times 7." As soon as you hear that 70 times 7, a lot of people would say, "Oh, that's referring back to Daniel chapter 9, and that there was 490 years left for the Jewish people, and after that, probation's closed for them." And that doesn't fit, one, with Romans 11. It doesn't fit with the fact that Jesus actually chose Paul as an apostle to the Gentiles. But more than that, if you just keep reading a couple verses later, it says, "For this reason, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his slaves. And when he had begun to settle them, one who owed him 10,000 talents was brought to him." In my Bible, I have a New American Standard Bible. It says that 1 talent was the equivalent to 15 years of wages.
Wow.
So times 10,000, that's 150,000 years of wages owed that is forgiven. And when I realized that, I had certain people telling me, "Oh, there's 70 times 7 worth of forgiveness." But then the parable is telling me that the king is going to forgive that servant 150,000 years.
Mm,
He's going to offer him 150,000 years worth of grace. I'm not using that as a literal number, but to say how big the forgiveness and grace of God is. And I think sometimes, like, personally, I spent too much time studying the Bible and not just reading it,
mm,
especially the Gospels. Just reading it. When you think about Paul
good
wrote
point.
letters,
Good
Paul
point.
wrote letters to the Philippians, to the Colossians. If Frank sent me a letter, I wouldn't start cherry picking something out of the middle of the letter. I'd start at the beginning,
Yeah.
and I'd read it. And if I didn't understand it, I'd go back, reread it. But I wouldn't be picking stuff out of there. Like,
Yeah.
there's a central, if you think of it like a microscope, there's different zoom powers. Like, yeah, you can, if you want, you can dig into the words and stuff, but you got to step back and, like, what is he talking about here? What was Jesus talking about in the Gospels? You
Yeah.
know, so yeah, we can
That's a
get caught up.
really, really good point.
We can get caught up so much, like, in you're too close to the page and everything becomes a blur. You just step
Yeah.
back a bit.
Yeah. I love that. I love that. Isn't that interesting that you spent too much time studying it instead of reading it?
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of addresses what I was saying before about the general Christian body and the Adventist view. When the Adventists hear a gospel message, they begin to study it instead of just hearing it and absorbing it and being appreciative of it. It's okay to disagree with things, to discuss things, but the thrust of the message, as Frank shared, and I encourage people to go back and watch today's gospel message, episode 14 in season 9. Go and watch it. It's about Paul's overarching message of we're in this together. It's community. What were you saying, Frank, that Jesus' kind of last words to the apostles were?
When he said, this is my command,
Yeah,
as he summed up all his teachings in the Gospel of John. This is my command, that you love one another.
yeah,
Love one another as I have loved you. By this
mm,
all men will know that you're my disciples. You
yeah,
know, I came out of a denomination that was saying, well, people will know we're the true people of God because we keep the Sabbath or because of the way we eat or,
Yeah.
et cetera, et cetera. And this was the cognitive dissonance that I started to develop as an Adventist,
yeah.
because I'd hear that, and then I'd go read the Gospel of John and read that. And it was like, wait a minute, something's not adding up.
Why are these not adding up? These two
Something's not
things,
adding up here.
and I
There's
think,
misplaced priorities here.
yeah, and I think when you focus on what is that sin, then you start having to dissect: is it a sin at 6 p.m. on a Saturday, or is it sunset? Or you start then getting into a, a land of analysis that's just, it is not helpful. Mark Anthony
But
writes, and I think this gives an example of that. He is saying the soul that sins is the soul that, sorry, the soul that sins, that soul shall die, and which suddenly opens up for, okay, well, so what's the soul sinning, and what am I doing, and what do you mean I will die? And but on the other hand, I've got this sense of assurance that I'm reading in Galatians and what Frank has said from Colossians.
Yeah, but the problem with
But
that
they're
again,
drilling down onto the sin and are missing the whole gospel
well,
point.
the problem again with that is that it's a proof text.
Yeah,
It's taking one text out of Ezekiel,
yeah,
ripping it out of its context. And what's the point you're trying to make?
yeah,
The point that Ezekiel was trying to make is that no longer will you say that we're being punished for the sins of our fathers.
yeah,
The soul that sins shall die. In other words, everyone's going to be responsible for themselves. You can't blame your ancestors. You can't blame your fathers. You got to be responsible for what you're doing as individuals and as this generation. Now,
yeah,
okay, so it's talking about personal responsibility to the Israelites as opposed to passing it off on, you know, our forefathers made us do this. But I don't know what the general point of that was in this
Well,
thread.
what Mark adds is, I was merely pointing out that you are responsible for your actions.
And I would agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a great thing to follow through into this life and to learn how to be more responsible. But it's not a salvational issue, and that's where everyone goes, what, hang on, so you're saying I can sin and I'll still get to heaven? And it just goes into this ping pong game of irrelevant back and forth of, yes, sin, it's important to try and not sin. Oh, so you're saying we won't get to heaven? No, I'm not saying that. And it's just like something I've noticed in Adventism,
yeah.
it just permeating is this back and forth discussion on sin without understanding the table they're even playing on. They're just batting this ball backwards and forwards.
You're constantly rehashing the same basic
Yeah,
knowledge, going over that stuff. Frank, what I take from his message, what he spoke about tonight, you can read and try to understand the gospel out of the word, but you've met the gospel also when you're in a community where you can tell people. I'll give you an example. When I was 18 years old, I left home to study, become an Adventist pastor. I left there 6 months later, joined the army, and 2 years later, I was in Afghanistan with a gun in my hand.
wow.
all right? When you come back 26 years later to the faith, when God calls you back, and the only place I ever knew was the SDA church, and you go back there, the way the people treat you after living a life like that,
Yeah.
it'll let you know pretty quick if they've tasted and seen how the Lord is good for
Yeah.
themselves.
Yes. Good point.
And Frank, like saying that when you've tasted the gospel, it changes the way you treat people,
Yes.
because you understand who you are, you understand your need of Christ, and you don't hold people up to a standard that
Yeah.
if you really dug down into your own life, you wouldn't want to hold yourself to that standard, because you'd live your life in utter desperation and disgust.
Yeah. Boy, I love that point. And I love whenever we might say to people, I've tasted something a bit different than what's been my upbringing in Adventism, they take offense, they feel triggered, they feel you're attacking their identity. You're actually just jumping for joy from the rooftops. You've tasted something. A friend of mine, Mark Savage, we were in grade 2 together in primary school over here in Australia, and he's just written, I hope you're well. I remember growing up as an Adventist in the holy city, Kurrambong here, in New South Wales, Australia. It is extremely hard to move on from what we have learned, and publicly move on completely. I will always have a soft spot in my heart for the SDA Church. Although not a practicing SDA, I have fond memories of the SDA Church, and the Sabbath we would keep. I also remember the strict adherence to the rules with not so many fond memories. And there seems to be often, and thanks for that, Mark, there seems to be this sense of needing to cling to it in a way. And that's why we find ourselves here in this sort of central station SDAQ&A land, with a lot of people going, I don't know where to go from here. Um, and I'm not even suggesting what train you must take or that you have to go anywhere. But I think what you just said there, Rick, is once you've tasted this something, you're not actually saying to other people, oh, you're bad, you should leave, or this is terrible. It's simply expressing a joy that perhaps you didn't find within the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And Frank has said before, some people do find it. So we're not even criticizing that. It's like, stop focusing on this little ping pong ball going backwards and forwards. Just focus on, hey, this is something we've discovered. Sure, find it in the Adventist Church. Maybe you can. But hey, there's another way that is, and I loved what you said in the actual program, Rick, in the comments about it. It's just so simple. It's simple. It's a simple understanding. Um,
But if I come in, if I come into contact and digest what I believe is the gospel, and what, like Frank was speaking about, like if it doesn't change the way I treat people, it doesn't matter
yes.
what church they're in. It doesn't matter, because when I think about what is the goal of my, like, what is God's goal for my life? He wants me to be with Him forever, and I'm gonna one day have to like share heaven with all kinds of people from all different denominations. If I can't get that now, if I can't tolerate people here, like what am I
Yeah,
going to do?
exactly. Yeah. My big takeaway, exciting feeling from Frank's message today was, yeah, we can do this. We can actually build a positive, vibrant community, and enjoy each other's company. And,
I
uh,
have to remember this when I get on the phone with my internet provider and get caught in their automated system.
yeah,
I'm not too tolerant then.
we're constantly faced with the challenges of being a better person. But we're in it together. We can do it together. And it doesn't mean we have to perfectly, you know, check the boxes every day.
Well,
Definitely not.
look, and that's just it. And I was having a discussion with somebody who we know, who was framing salvation as it's a totally legal arrangement. Adam 1 sinned, Adam, and broke the law, and Israel broke the law, and Adam 2 kept the law. Totally legal. But if you look throughout the New Testament, justification has legal content to it, right? Describing salvation. Salvation isn't described just by justification, which Paul, by the way, only uses when he's talking about the equal inclusion of Gentiles with Jews in the body of Christ. He talks about salvation in terms of reconciliation. He talks about it in terms of adoption. He talks about it in terms of covenant. Covenant is behind all of it, by the way. But he likens the marriage covenant to God's covenant relationship with his people. The word for salvation that's used for salvation, that's translated salvation, is also the word that's often used to translate as healing. It's where we get the word therapy from. So you start getting all these rich images of what salvation is, and you start putting together all these word pictures. You realize it's so far, what God has done and is doing is so far beyond human description that human language can't even contain it. But there are so many relational overtones and overtones of healing. God looking not only to heal people, but to heal his entire creation is part of the gospel, or the goal of the gospel. So
another one is John 17:3, like knowing God and Jesus Christ is eternal life.
Yeah. Which is yeah. But then Jesus frames that knowing God, that oneness with God, as their oneness with one another. Once again, it gets back to that. Is knowing God just knowing him personally through private experience? I'm not saying there's none of that. But, Jesus in John's gospel talks about abiding in him and puts it in terms of, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. And then boils it down to their loving one another is the way that they abide in him. It really, we have such a narrow view of what the gospel is very often, where the New Testament is brimming with these images and ways of describing it that are that address so many facets of what it means to be human. Truly human in the sight of God.
This is what I like about this community too, is that Frank can share a viewpoint. There might be things about that I differ with, but there's no, at least on my part, there's never any frustration. Whether it's Stephen Beagles, Miss Jillian Ford. I've been able to send private messages to people when I've had questions. People have been very, very kind.
Yeah.
And there's no judgment. There's some questions that I asked that if I knew if I asked these questions in a conservative Adventist church,
Yeah.
Where it's like I can ask these questions, and I won't say the whole Adventist church is like that, because I have a pastor friend that I study with every week, and whatever happens in my life, I'll always study. I'll always want to study with him, because he's just very open-minded, kind person, loving person, and his group is really loving. So, as long as people are kind and polite, and we're all seeking to help each other grow in our knowledge of, I'll never, put an X on anyone.
Yeah. Yeah. In my recent interview with Logan Smith and Andrew Skeggs, and Andrew Skeggs is an Adventist pastor. Logan has left the church and is agnostic, but he and Andrew are now best mates. They're best friends. And Andrew helped him, as he shared in the interview, through a lot of mental health struggles that he had. Andrew was there for him. Andrew was demonstrating this joy he'd found in the gospel, and there it's working. So again, I want to point out to people, we're not condemning. If anything, that comes from a vibe of condemnation from me to the Adventist Church is more about a systemic problem they have with upholding Ellen White way beyond the authority she should have at any level. But that's a whole other discussion. Nancy Claiborne wrote earlier. I had a great chat with Nancy and Mark the other week too. Really enjoyed that. Season 9 has been such a fascinating season so far. I'm really enjoying the conversations I'm having. She's saying the time is right. That was from my earlier saying, how come it's been 8 years before I've even thought about bringing, just saying, hey guys, here's someone sharing the gospel message into quite a robust community of SDAQ&As. Yeah, the time is right now. Is there anything you guys can see in the comments you'd like to add to? We'll wrap it up soon. I know it's getting late there for Frank, probably for you too, Rick.
I just wanted to say, like, I watched that interview with Andrew Skeggs. I must have watched it already like 5 times.
Wow.
And it speaks to me because when you ask them, you should get this kind of support group going for people who have, left the Adventist church but are dealing with mental issues and stuff. I'm saying it also, like, people who leave need some kind of support.
100%.
They need some kind of, like, 100%. I know they need support.
Yeah.
But yeah, and if Andrew Skeggs is watching, I mean, I watched that. I mean, he's one of the funniest guys,
isn't he?
He cracked me up. Me up. I watched like 5 times, but yeah, there needs some kind of support system for people. And I speak to this as being an ex-military. When you go overseas and you come back and you've seen all kinds of stuff, you don't just go right back into civilian life without dealing with things, and you need some kind of support. But the same PTSD that I could go through going to Afghanistan, you can find that same PTSD.
Yeah,
and I'm not joking when I say that. You can find it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I even was surprised when I left. I think I've chatted to both of you separately about this. I felt like my transition after being 5th generation marinated in it, though I did have a much more gospel-oriented view here at Avondale at the peak of the Des Fords and the Magnusons and these kind of, really righteous by faith lecturers and scholars. I was literally neighbors with them. But even though I had all of that, music kind of saved me, because when I was 11, I discovered Jimi Hendrix and I found Creedence and the Stones and the Beatles, and then I've just followed music and music culture. That in many ways, leaving the Adventist church wasn't as hard as it could have been if I didn't already have an identity as a musician in the secular world. So I wasn't just a gospel musician. However, having said that, when I did leave, unexpectedly, about 2 years in, I did start going, boy, I'm feeling anxiety, stress, depression, like post-traumatic stress disorder. I didn't know who I was, and it took a good 5 years to really grasp. And doing this show really helped me, actually. But you're right, Rick.
I've got to say that it's pretty common practice in the Protestant world for people to leave their denominations and their churches all the time and go elsewhere. You go to the Methodist church in one part of town and then you decide, hey, that non-denominational church is great across town. Why don't we go there instead? Or the Congregational church is great.
And it's no big deal.
Here in Connecticut, we have a Congregational church, a Methodist church, a Baptist church, an Episcopal church, and then there's a Catholic church as well. So that's 5 churches in a small area.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And when people leave, generally from one church to go to another, no one bats an eye.
Yeah,
it's like, oh, okay, you just find that, that denomination or that congregation suits your needs better or suits you better, But when you leave Adventism, it's like leaving the mafia.
Yeah. Yeah. Isn't it funny that we laugh about it, but it's serious.
people need support, because
Yeah.
there's a lot of cultish kinds of tendencies to Seventh-day Adventism that I'm just coming to grips with
Mm.
now, seeing the actual extremity of it.
Well, hopefully
It's
SDAQ&A, as we build a community in here, that can be some kind of support as well,
yeah.
hopefully. Yeah.
And I think also you
I
can
have to
look
go,
at,
guys.
Yeah. Hey, look, we'll say farewell to you, Frank, and I just want to, and then Rick and I
Thanks.
will just wrap it up. But I do want to say thank you so much for your message today. I
yeah, thanks, Frank.
Thank
encourage
you.
people watching to go back season 9, episode 14, SDA Church. It's going to happen regularly. If people can support what I'm doing, I've brought up the donation spots there. I only say that because I want to make it an extra day. I want to do my continued 2 normal time slots, but I want to see once a week just a regular gospel message going into this community. But to do that, it will take me an extra 3 or 4 hours a week, and I'm happy to do it. I do it for nothing, but if people can click that little donation code, that just helps me put food on the table and keep doing what I love doing. But
Yeah.
I really gained so much from that message, Frank, and myself and Rick and a
Amen.
bunch of people watching. Just want to thank you so much for that,
Yep,
Thanks.
and
thanks.
we want to
Thanks
have
for
you back
having me.
very soon. So let's
Okay.
get you back very soon.
All right.
Thank you, Frank. Everyone
Thanks.
God
send some
bless you,
love
Frank.
hearts and
Good night.
comments,
You
and
too, Rick. Good night.
we'll talk to you again soon. See you,
Okay.
Frank. Thank
Bye-bye.
you. And yeah, it was a great message, wasn't it, Rick? And as I hear a bit of your journey, I'm super keen to have you do a gospel message one day, and also an interview as well. Next week, I've got Michael. I'm not sure if it's pronounced Coburn. It's Colburn. Sometimes it's a silent L, and he's been writing a lot on various platforms, including ours recently. And he just shared that yesterday he wrote his leaving letter
Mm,
to the church. You mentioned earlier that you've just done that,
yeah.
and as you said, you don't want to talk about it right now, but that's a big thing, and it's a very emotional thing to do. And no matter how much your brain is going, done the right thing, I've done this, you're about to feel some stuff that you may not have expected. So I hope that
Mm.
share here. You got friends in here that'll help you through.
You know what, Peter? Like I wrote it, sent it, and because I was a part of an online church,
Right.
so I wrote it, sent it, and then I told my wife. I said, "Yeah, like we don't, besides the Bible study that we do with my pastor friend who's an STA, so we don't really have a community right now anymore, I guess." And I said, I just wish I had a Christian community, you know. And we had a lot of rain here recently, and the park that we go to sometimes is flooded. So my wife said, "Let's go to the park." So we get to the park, and my wife had a T-shirt on it. It had a cross on it. It said "Faith." This guy out of nowhere just comes up to us, and he's like, "Hey, how you doing?" I was like, "Hey," and he's like, "I saw your wife's T-shirt. You guys Christian?" "Yeah." And I live in a town where it's probably 99% people are French, but this guy just shows up speaking English, and he's a Christian, and his wife's a Christian. We had a beautiful conversation sitting there in the park, and it was like God winking at me that this is not the end. You know, it's not over just because I took this decision.
Yes.
You know,
Great.
and
Yeah.
I think that I think it all depends on our perception and how we look at people.
Yeah.
Um, my pastor friend, who's an STA, Pastor Dan, um, he never panicked. He knew I was on this journey of searching, and he never panicked about it. And I remember him telling me, I'd rather see you searching and you moving than just doing nothing.
Yeah.
The fact that we are searching is a good thing.
Yeah.
So I think when people are shifting around and moving around and searching, it's not a bad thing. Even if they end up leaving,
Yeah.
it's not necessarily a bad thing because at least they're searching for God.
Yeah. Seek and you shall find.
Yep.
Yeah. And yeah. Rachel, we'll bring up a couple of more and then we'll say farewell to everyone for this after party where we've been discussing episode 14, season 9, where Frank Merendino shared a gospel message into the SDA community. Of course, we're going to get back to some great biffo and controversial conversations, but hopefully we're now providing a space where that every week, hopefully that's the vision, we get to have a positive good news message coming in every week. And as I said earlier, I'd love, Rick, if you could prepare one for us. If you accept the challenge, let me know and we'll make it happen the next week. And I think people are
Sharing the gospel, Peter. You only have to look at your own life. I mean, like I said, after leaving pastor school and going to war,
yeah,
which if you're an
mind blowing.
SDA, I mean, I was all over the news. They got interviews that I did because in a French regiment, but I spoke English. So all the English news stations, like on YouTube, there's videos of me,
Wow.
and
You got to send me some links.
yeah, I'll send you a couple. And you know how it is in the SDA church, no carrying guns and stuff like this. But when in the back of my mind for 26 years, I told myself, God doesn't want to have anything to do with me anymore. I went from pastor school to war. He doesn't want anything to do with me.
Wow.
And 26 years later, when the time was right for him to call me back, he did it. And that's like, yeah, I mean, I try to understand the biblical gospel, but I know what Rick's gospel is in my heart. I know what God did for me.
And I think a difference between what I was saying about my experience, where I wasn't expecting some of the stuff I felt. I think you've already prepared yourself for stuff, and I think your transition is going to be much easier. I take back a bit what I
Could be.
said there. I think you've already had way more than the average bear should ever experience, and you've already fallen in love with the concept of the gospel that I have only just begun starting to understand, that you've been preparing. So I think me sending my I'm leaving letter preceded a lot of my growth. I think you've had a lot of growth, and your letter is putting a full stop to a period of time that you will now celebrate and move on with great abundance. I think is going to happen. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's no ill feelings towards anybody. Like I love the Adventist brethren. Christ died for each and every one of us. But it's just time. It's just time for me to like, when I was like, I don't want to take up too much time, but when I was 18 years old, I did some things like everyone does when they're young, dumb, and the church actually like had an excommunication meeting, an excommunion public, trial or whatever you call it for me, which ended up not passing. But the fact that went on, I was like, I'm out of here, like, so all of this pushing me away from it seems like God, but God, when it's time, he makes his gospel very real, and it's not on the pages of a book, but it's in the heart of a man. And he's made it real for me, and he's extended his grace. Maybe I seem like a bit of a hippie when I'm in the chat, but I just don't believe in excluding anyone, because I just don't think God's like that. I mean, as long as people are searching for God and have a desire, and sometimes they don't even know it. I mean, they're just, if people are searching for something better, I mean, it's for sure that the God I know, he's willing and ready to like make that known. So yeah, I'm done.
Yeah, awesome. And thank you, Sherilyn. She's just written, this channel is such a blessing to me. I so appreciate it. I don't feel so alone. Tonight's gospel message and after party has given me some peace. I love hearing that, because that, really helps me feel like I don't feel alone as well, because I have definitely felt that, which would be, some people would be surprised to hear that.
Can I just say something to Sherilyn there about that comment?
Yeah.
In every letter that Paul wrote, he begins his letters with grace and peace. The gospel is supposed to bring grace and peace to a person. And if it's not bringing that, if it's bringing heaviness. Jesus says, "Come to me, all you weary and heavy laden, I'll give you rest. His yoke is easy and his burden is light." If it's not that, you should be asking yourself questions, and be open to,
Yeah,
different.
yeah, yeah. Good point. Rose Power, who I hope to have on the program later on. Rose, shoot me a message. She's written here. There are a lot of people that the Adventist Church has driven away, and while she's not saying everyone, that is true. That is true, and that's why in my discussion with Andrew and Logan recently, I was trying to infer there is some culpability. Is that the right word? That the church needs to go, you know what, you guys actually have driven some people out,
Mm.
and you need to just not wash your hands of those people. It's not just the formers and those on the fringe and those who are struggling that have to set up their own little self-help groups. While that's a great idea, and Logan looks like he's going to start doing something like that with Andrew's help, I think the church needs to take some responsibility there, but I don't know if they ever will. I don't know if they
I
even
don't know what
see it.
I don't know. I don't know at what level they can and should do that, because if you take, for instance, Andrew Skeggs, I'm sure the congregation that he takes care of, compared to other congregations that are more conservative and rigid,
Mm,
you know, it's there's probably not a lot of people walking around in his church feeling overburdened and post traumatic.
yeah,
so
yeah, yeah,
so it's tough. Like, it's tough to put it to say it's the fault of the Adventist
and
church. It's
yes,
local congregations. There's a wide spectrum of congregation difference.
that's true. And yes, and often if they do have meetings where they say, "Hey, let's do something to help those that have left the church," it's usually in a way that let's proselytize them back in somehow. Let's do it to get them back. I
Mm,
love just people doing stuff. I love Doctors Without Borders. They're just,
mm.
I think they're an atheist charity, and they're just doing good stuff. And I'd love people just to focus on helping people's mental health and just feeling supported and listened to and valued. So, yeah.
Me, Peter, my wife and I, we have this small ministry. It's called Rest Ministry, and and,
Mm,
and
love
seriously,
that.
all we do is that when people need someone to talk to, we just sit down on Zoom with them, and that's it.
I love that. How
Like,
can people get in touch with you about that? Can you?
yeah, email address is rest.ministries with an S .jr@gmail.com. I
Are
can
you,
put it in.
if you can you change that on your where it says your name? Can you just change that to an email address, and then that way people can do it. And while you're doing that, just going to give a quick plug for those watching tomorrow at 6:30 p.m. Pacific, Wednesday, and Australia, Sydney, New South Wales, 11:30 a.m. I'm having another one of my the scholars conversations where it's not actually a conversation. I just say hi, topic, and I sit out and let the person present. And it's been popular. It's been popular too because people don't like me interrupting, and also the scholars are like, "Hey, thanks," and I feel proud about this. You're not asking me hard questions. I just get to say what I want to say. So tomorrow we've got. Oh, good. Thanks for that. So tomorrow we've got Matthew Corpman talking about did Ellen White see the Apocrypha as inspirational works? Now, have you brought that also up on your screen? I
Yeah,
can't.
I couldn't figure out how to
Oh,
change
here
my
we go.
name.
I think I've been able to do it. Let's bring that onto the screen because that sounds amazing. Can you just say one more time what that
Well,
is?
yeah, essentially what we do is, people who have experienced, just whatever church hurt, if they just need someone to talk to, if they have questions, we just do our best. But what we meet most of the time are people who just need someone to talk to. Seriously, it, you'd be surprised how hard it is to find someone who will just sit down. And if it takes an hour, it takes an hour. If it takes three, it takes three. Um, but just sit down with people. and just let them unload the clip. That's what my wife always say. Just let them unload their clip. They might have frustrations, whatever. Just sit through it.
See, that is an incredible thing that you're offering there for people and those in the SDA community, SDAQ&A community, I should add. If are feeling that you could benefit from connecting with Rick and his wife, rest.ministries.jr@gmail.com. Send a message. I love being able to send people to places where they can get help and connection and that kind of thing.
And
Look,
it's not an SDA ministry. It's not
no,
it. We're just people trying to. We're
help
all
each
going
other.
through the same life, yeah, and help each other
Yeah,
out.
yeah. So closing with a couple of quick messages and then we'll say goodnight. Barry Ford, the problem with the SDAs is they have to be right, and it's all about being right. And that's kind of what I was saying about even some of the gospel Adventists. They are in their own little factions and they proudly say, hey, don't put us in one lump. But they shoot at each other as well, like, because they've got to be right. No, my gospel message is more right than your gospel message. And I see them fighting as much. And Rose Power just added the problem is individual Adventists who had to destroy others to make themselves look good, and and no one says anything because they don't want to be targeted themselves. There is a lot of silence within the Adventist Church. Angela has just said, do I have another way to contribute besides PayPal? Those in Australia can do a direct deposit. And I am just setting up there's Pay ID, but I don't know if that's overseas, and another one called Stripe, and there is credit card as well. But yeah, if anyone is interested in supporting my ministry in other ways than PayPal, which currently is primarily the only way, I can offer some other options there. Mate, it's been so good just randomly catching up with you again and getting to have you on the program. And yeah, please shoot me a message ASAP. I'd love you to come on as soon as you can to be our next SDAQ&A Church Gospel presenter. So you shoot me a message and let's make that happen.
Right
It's
on.
time. It's time. Now is the time. Thank you, everyone, for watching our after party. Go and check out season 9, episode 14, Frank Merendino. And until tomorrow, stay safe, live long and prosper.
See ya.